William James begins his philosophy not with a fixed system, but with a problem that feels immediately real. Human beings are constantly searching for certainty. They want clear answers, stable truths, and firm foundations that cannot be shaken. But when James looks at the world honestly, he does not see that kind of certainty. He sees something far more fluid, more complex, and less predictable. This becomes the starting point of his thought. Instead of forcing reality into a rigid structure, he asks a different question. What if truth is not something fixed and permanent, but something that develops through experience? What if understanding is not about discovering absolute certainty, but about learning how to navigate a constantly changing world? This shift changes everything. James does not reject truth, but he redefines it. He argues that truth is not simply something that exists independently, waiting to be discovered in a complete and final form. Instead, truth is something that happens. It emerges through interaction between a person and their experience. An idea becomes true, in his view, not just because it matches some abstract reality, but because it works in practice. Because it helps a person make sense of their experience, solve problems, and move forward in a meaningful way. This is the foundation of what becomes known as pragmatism. Pragmatism, in James's philosophy, is not about being practical in a narrow sense. It is about evaluating ideas based on their consequences. Instead of asking whether an idea is absolutely true in a detached sense, he asks what difference it makes. If a belief changes how a person lives, acts, or understands the world, then it has meaning. This approach avoids endless abstract debates that cannot be resolved. Instead of arguing about ideas that have no impact on experience, pragmatism focuses only on those ideas that actually affect life. For James, this makes philosophy more grounded. It becomes something connected to real living, not just theoretical discussion. At the same time, he is careful not to reduce truth to something purely subjective. He does not argue that anything can be true if someone believes it. Instead, he emphasizes that ideas must still be tested through experience. They must prove themselves over time. An idea that consistently helps a person navigate reality, that remains useful and reliable, gains the status of truth. But even then, it is not fixed forever. It can be revised if new experiences show its limits. This creates a dynamic understanding of truth. It is not something that is completed once and for all. It is always open to change as experience grows. This view reflects a deeper belief that reality itself is not static. James sees the world as something in motion, constantly developing rather than existing in a finished state. Because of this, human knowledge must also remain flexible. Another important part of his philosophy is his focus on experience. He believes that philosophy should begin with what is directly experienced, rather than abstract assumptions. When people try to explain the world, they often simplify it. They create categories, systems, and definitions that make things easier to understand. But in doing so, they often lose the richness of actual experience. James wants to return to that richness. He emphasizes that experience is not neatly organized. It is continuous, complex, and sometimes contradictory. Any philosophical system that ignores this complexity risks becoming disconnected from reality. This leads him to challenge strict forms of rationalism, which try to explain everything through fixed principles and logical structures. While he values reason, he does not believe it can capture the full depth of human experience. There are aspects of life that go beyond pure logic. Emotions, instincts, and personal perspectives all play a role in how people understand the world. Ignoring these elements creates an incomplete picture. Because of this, James develops a more inclusive approach. He allows for multiple ways of understanding reality, as long as they connect meaningfully to experience. This openness becomes especially important when he turns to the topic of belief. People often hold beliefs that cannot be proven with complete certainty, especially in areas like religion, morality, and personal purpose. Traditional philosophy might reject these beliefs as unjustified, but James takes a different approach. He asks whether it is ever reasonable to believe something without complete evidence. His answer is yes, under certain conditions. He argues that when a decision is unavoidable, when it is meaningful, and when evidence cannot fully resolve it, a person has the right to choose their belief. This is what he calls the will to believe. This idea is not about ignoring evidence or believing anything without reason. It is about recognizing that in some situations, waiting for absolute certainty is not possible. Life requires decisions, and those decisions often involve uncertainty. In such cases, belief becomes a kind of action. Choosing to believe something can shape how a person experiences the world and how they act within it. This is especially clear in areas like trust, relationships, and personal goals. A person often has to believe in something before it can become real in their experience. Without that initial commitment, certain possibilities never develop. At this stage, James's philosophy presents a world that is open, flexible, and deeply connected to human experience. Truth is not fixed, but evolving. Belief is not purely passive, but active. Knowledge is not complete, but always developing. This creates a very different tone compared to more rigid systems. Instead of offering final answers, he offers a method, a way of thinking that adapts, responds, and grows. And as this foundation is established, his philosophy begins to move further, exploring how this flexible understanding of truth shapes human psychology, decision-making, and the deeper structure of reality itself, where experience, belief, and action come together in a constantly changing world. As William James continues to develop his philosophy, he moves deeper into the structure of human experience itself, not just how we think about truth, but how we actually live, feel, decide, and perceive reality from moment to moment. This shift is important because for James, philosophy is never separate from life. It must explain not only abstract ideas, but the full complexity of being human. He begins to examine consciousness. And here he introduces one of his most influential ideas, the concept of the stream of consciousness. Instead of seeing the mind as a collection of separate thoughts or fixed units, he describes it as a continuous flow. Thoughts do not come in isolated pieces. They move, blend, shift, and transform into one another without clear boundaries. This idea challenges earlier views that try to break the mind into simple elements. James argues that when we actually observe our own thinking, we do not experience it as disconnected fragments. We experience it as a flowing process, where each moment carries traces of the past and anticipations of the future. Within this stream, he identifies an important distinction. There are moments that are clear and defined, and there are moments that are vague and transitional. He sometimes describes these as the substantive parts and the transitive parts of thought. The substantive parts are the stable moments where we can clearly identify what we are thinking. But the transitive parts are just as important. These are the movements between thoughts, the subtle shifts, the connections that give continuity to the flow. Most philosophical systems, he argues, focus only on the clear, definable parts and ignore the transitions. But without these transitions, thought would not make sense. It would be a series of disconnected points with no continuity. By emphasizing the full flow of consciousness, James presents a more accurate picture of how the mind actually works. This also has deeper implications. It means that human experience cannot be fully captured by rigid categories or static definitions. It is always moving, always changing. From here, he begins to explore the idea of the self. Traditionally, the self has often been treated as something stable and fixed, a single identity that remains the same over time. But James complicates this idea. He suggests that the self is not a single, unchanging entity, but a collection of different aspects that are constantly interacting. There is the material self, which includes the body and possessions. There is the social self, which changes depending on how we are seen by others. And there is the spiritual self, which relates to inner thoughts, values, and sense of identity. These aspects are not separate in a strict sense. but they show that the self is more complex than a single, unified core. It is dynamic, shaped by experience, relationships, and internal reflection. This leads to another important insight. Because the self is not fixed, it can change. A person is not permanently defined by their past. They are constantly becoming something new through their experiences and choices. This idea connects back to his view of truth. Just as truth is not fixed, the self is not fixed. Both are part of an ongoing process rather than a completed state. At the same time, James does not suggest that this makes life unstable or meaningless. Instead, he sees it as a source of possibility. Because nothing is completely fixed, there is always room for change, growth, and new understanding. He then turns to the role of attention and habit in shaping experience. These ideas are central to how people actually live day to day. Attention, for James, is what determines what becomes real in our experience. The world is filled with more information than we can possibly process. What we attend to becomes our reality, while everything else fades into the background. This means that life is not just given to us. It is shaped by what we focus on. Two people can live in the same environment, but experience completely different realities depending on where they direct their attention. This gives attention a kind of power. By choosing what to focus on, a person can influence how they experience the world. But attention is not always under conscious control. This is where habit becomes important. James sees habit as one of the most powerful forces in human life. Habits shape behavior, thought patterns, and emotional responses. Once formed, they operate automatically, reducing the need for constant decision-making. This has both positive and negative effects. Good habits can support stability, efficiency, and growth. But harmful habits can trap a person in patterns that are difficult to change. Because of this, James emphasizes the importance of forming habits carefully. Small actions, repeated over time, create lasting patterns. A single decision may seem insignificant, but repeated decisions shape the direction of a person's life. He encourages deliberate effort in the formation of habits. Act decisively when forming a new habit. Repeat the desired behavior consistently. Avoid exceptions that weaken the pattern. Over time, what was once difficult becomes natural. This idea connects to his broader philosophy. Just as truth is something that develops through experience, character is something that develops through repeated action. He then moves into the emotional side of human experience. One of his most well-known contributions here is his theory of emotion, often referred to as the James Lange theory. Instead of believing that emotions come first and physical reactions follow, he suggests the opposite. According to James, we do not run because we are afraid. We feel afraid because we are running. In other words, the body reacts first, and the emotion is the mind's interpretation of that reaction. This idea challenges the common assumption that emotions are purely internal. It suggests that the body and mind are deeply connected, and that physical states play a central role in emotional experience. This has practical implications. By changing physical behavior, posture, or action, a person may influence how they feel. Emotion is not completely fixed. It is part of a dynamic interaction between body and mind. As his philosophy develops further, James begins to explore the idea of pluralism. He rejects the idea that reality is a single, unified system with one final explanation. Instead, he suggests that reality is made up of many parts, many perspectives, and many forms of experience. This pluralistic view allows for diversity in thought, belief, and understanding. It accepts that different people may experience and interpret reality in different ways, without requiring that everything be reduced to a single system. This openness is one of the defining features of his philosophy. It resists rigid conclusions and allows for complexity. At this stage, his thought becomes richer and more connected. Consciousness is flowing. The self is dynamic. Attention shapes reality. Habits shape behavior. Emotions connect body and mind. And reality itself is not singular but multiple. All of these ideas work together to form a picture of human life that is active rather than passive. People are not simply observers of a fixed world. They are participants in a changing process, shaping and being shaped at the same time. And as this perspective becomes clearer, the next stage of his philosophy begins to move even deeper, exploring how belief, action, and experience come together to form a complete view of reality, where truth is not only understood, but lived through choices, risks, and a willingness to engage with an uncertain world. As William James's philosophy moves into its deeper stage, it begins to bring together everything he has developed so far and pushes it into the most human part of existence, the place where thought turns into decision and decision turns into life. At this point, his ideas are no longer just about understanding truth or describing the mind, but about how a person actually moves forward in a world that is uncertain, open, and constantly changing. He returns again to the problem of belief, but now with greater intensity. If truth is not fixed, if the self is constantly evolving, and if experience is always incomplete, then every important decision in life must be made without absolute certainty. This is not a temporary problem that can be solved with more knowledge. It is a permanent condition of human life. James recognizes that this creates a kind of tension. On one hand, people want evidence before they believe something. On the other hand, life often requires belief before evidence can fully appear. Waiting for complete proof can mean never acting at all. This is where his idea of the will to believe becomes central, not as a theory, but as a necessity. He argues that there are situations where a person is forced to choose, even without sufficient evidence, and that refusing to choose is itself a choice with consequences. He describes certain decisions as genuine options. These are choices that are living, meaning they are real possibilities for the person, forced, meaning they cannot be avoided, and momentous, meaning they carry significant consequences. In these situations, neutrality is not truly possible. For example, trusting another person, committing to a path in life, or adopting a guiding belief about the world. These are not decisions that can always wait for proof. They require a leap, not blind or irrational, but based on the recognition that action must come before certainty. This idea reshapes the role of belief. Belief is not just a passive acceptance of evidence. It becomes an active force that shapes reality. By choosing to believe something, a person changes how they act, and through action, they change what becomes possible. James illustrates this with simple but powerful examples. If a person believes that they will fail, they may never attempt something, and their failure becomes real. If they believe success is possible, they act differently, and that belief helps create the conditions for success. In this way, belief is not detached from reality. It participates in creating it. At the same time, he does not suggest that belief should ignore evidence completely. He maintains a balance. In areas where evidence can decide, it should be followed. But in areas where evidence is incomplete and action is required, belief has a legitimate role. This balance allows him to avoid both extremes. He does not fall into rigid skepticism that refuses to act, nor into blind faith that ignores reality. Instead, he creates a middle path where belief and evidence interact. From here, James moves into one of the most profound aspects of his philosophy, the idea that reality itself is still in the making. He rejects the view that the universe is a finished system with everything already determined. Instead, he sees it as something open, something that is still being shaped. This idea is sometimes described as a pluralistic universe. Reality is not a single, closed structure. It is made up of many parts, many processes, many perspectives, all interacting and developing over time. In this kind of universe, human action matters in a real way. It is not just a small detail within a fixed system. It contributes to how things unfold. Choices are not illusions. They have genuine effects. This gives human life a kind of weight and responsibility. A person is not just observing reality. They are participating in its development. This perspective also changes how uncertainty is viewed. Instead of being a weakness or a limitation, Uncertainty becomes a condition of possibility. Because the future is not fixed, new outcomes can emerge. Because knowledge is incomplete, discovery is possible. James sees this openness as something positive. It allows for creativity, growth, and change. It means that life is not locked into a predetermined path. At the same time, this openness requires courage. Without certainty, a person must be willing to act without guarantees. They must accept the risk that comes with decision. This brings him back to the practical side of his philosophy. He is not only describing how things are, but how a person should live within this kind of world. He suggests that a meaningful life involves engagement rather than withdrawal. Instead of waiting for perfect knowledge, a person should act, experiment, and learn through experience. Life becomes a process of testing ideas, adjusting beliefs, and moving forward. This is where pragmatism becomes fully active. Ideas are not just judged in theory, but in practice. A belief proves itself by how it works in life, how it helps a person navigate challenges, and how it shapes experience over time. He also emphasizes the importance of energy and effort. A passive approach to life does not fit his philosophy. Because reality is still in the making, a person must participate actively. Their effort contributes to what becomes real. This leads to a kind of moral dimension, not in the sense of fixed rules, but in the sense of responsibility for one's choices. Since actions have real effects, a person must consider how they act and what they contribute to the world. At this stage, James's philosophy becomes both empowering and demanding. It gives the individual freedom, but it also gives them responsibility. There is no fixed path to follow, but there is also no escape from the need to choose. Another important idea that emerges here is the role of risk. To live fully, according to James, is to accept that risk cannot be eliminated. Every meaningful decision involves uncertainty. Trying to avoid all risk leads to inaction and missed possibilities. He suggests that a certain willingness to risk is necessary for growth. Without it, life becomes limited and closed. With it, new experiences and outcomes become possible. This does not mean reckless behavior. It means thoughtful engagement with uncertainty, acting with awareness, but without waiting for impossible certainty. As all these ideas come together, James presents a view of life that is dynamic, open, and deeply connected to action. Truth is not fixed, the self is not static, reality is not complete, and belief is not passive. Everything is in motion. A person lives within this movement, constantly interpreting, choosing, and acting. Their understanding evolves, their beliefs are tested, and their experience deepens. And as this movement continues, the final stage of his philosophy begins to bring everything into a single perspective, asking what it ultimately means to live well in a world that is not finished, where truth grows, belief acts, and human life plays a real role in shaping what becomes real. As William James's philosophy reaches its final stage, everything he has developed begins to come together into a single, living perspective. It is no longer just about truth or consciousness or belief in isolation. It becomes a complete way of understanding what it means to live in a world that is open, unfinished, and shaped through experience. At this point, the central idea becomes clear. Reality is not something fully formed that we simply observe. It is something still in the process of becoming, and human life is part of that process. Every thought, every belief, every action contributes, even in small ways, to how that reality unfolds. This gives a different weight to existence. A person is not just trying to discover truth, but also participating in its development. Truth, in this sense, is not separate from life. It grows through experience, through testing, through action, and through time. He returns again to pragmatism, but now in its fullest meaning. The value of an idea lies in what it does in life. Does it help a person navigate the world? Does it make experience more coherent? Does it allow for growth, understanding, and meaningful action? Ideas are not judged in isolation. They are judged by their consequences by the difference they make when they are lived. This shifts the focus away from abstract perfection and toward practical engagement. A person does not need to find final, unchanging answers. They need to find ways of thinking that allow them to move forward, to act, and to adapt. At the same time, James emphasizes that this does not lead to chaos or complete relativism. Not every idea works equally well. Some beliefs lead to confusion, conflict, or limitation. Others lead to clarity, stability, and possibility. Over time, through experience, certain ideas prove themselves more reliable than others. They become stable not because they are absolutely fixed, but because they continue to work across different situations. This creates a kind of evolving stability. Truth is not permanent in the traditional sense, but it is not random either. It develops through a continuous process of testing and revision. He then brings together his ideas about belief and action in a final way. Belief is not something that waits for complete certainty. It is something that guides action in the face of uncertainty. A person must often act before they know everything. They must commit to paths, trust in possibilities, and move forward without guarantees. This is not a flaw in human reasoning. It is a necessary part of living in an open world. In this sense, life itself becomes experimental. Each decision is a kind of test. Each belief is a hypothesis that is lived rather than just thought. This experimental approach removes the fear of being completely wrong. Since knowledge is always developing, mistakes are not final failures. They are part of the process of learning and adjustment. This creates a more flexible and resilient way of living. A person is not locked into rigid beliefs, but also not lost in constant doubt. They move forward, observe results, and refine their understanding over time. James also returns to the idea of the self, now seen as something that is continuously shaped through this process. A person is not defined once and for all. They become who they are through the accumulation of experiences, choices, and habits. This gives human life a sense of openness. The future is not fixed. A person can change direction, develop new habits, and form new beliefs. Identity is not static. It evolves. At the same time, he emphasizes responsibility. Because choices matter, because actions have consequences, a person must take ownership of how they live. Freedom is not just the ability to choose, but the responsibility to choose carefully. He also reflects on the role of effort and energy. In a world that is still being formed, passive observation is not enough. A meaningful life requires engagement. It requires willingness to act, to try, and to participate. This engagement does not need to be dramatic. It can appear in small, consistent actions. But what matters is that a person is involved, not detached from their own life. Another important aspect of his final perspective is his openness to multiple forms of experience, including religious and spiritual experience. James does not insist on a single interpretation of these experiences. Instead, he evaluates them in pragmatic terms. If a belief or experience leads to greater meaning, stability, or moral depth in a person's life, then it has value. This allows for diversity in how people understand deeper questions, without forcing everything into one system. This pluralistic openness becomes one of the defining features of his philosophy. Reality is not reduced to a single explanation. Different perspectives can coexist as long as they connect meaningfully to experience. As everything comes together, James presents a vision of life that is active, flexible, and grounded in reality. A life where certainty is limited, but possibility is open. Where truth is not fixed, but growing. Where belief is not passive, but shaping action. In this world, a person is not expected to find final answers. They are expected to engage, to think, to choose, and to adapt. This creates a different kind of peace. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of participation. A sense that even without complete answers, one can still live meaningfully, act responsibly, and move forward with clarity. In the end, William James does not give a closed system or a final conclusion. He offers something more flexible and more alive. A way of thinking that stays connected to experience. A way of living that accepts uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. And a way of understanding truth as something that grows through the ongoing interaction between mind, action, and the ever-changing world. William James was born in 1842 into a world that was beginning to question the stability of its own foundations. Science was advancing rapidly, uncovering new truths about the physical world, while traditional religious beliefs were starting to lose their unquestioned authority. The gap between what could be measured and what could be believed was widening, and within that gap, a deeper uncertainty began to form. People were no longer asking only what is true, but how truth itself should be understood. Into this environment came a thinker who would refuse to choose sides, not fully accepting rigid scientific determinism, and not returning to unquestioned faith, but instead attempting to understand how human experience itself shapes what we call reality. He was born into an intellectually rich and somewhat unconventional family. His father was deeply interested in philosophy and theology, exposing him from an early age to a wide range of ideas. This environment did not impose a single worldview, but encouraged exploration, discussion, and even disagreement. As a result, his early life was marked not by certainty, but by openness. He learned to engage with ideas without immediately committing to them, a habit that would define his entire approach to philosophy. His education was broad and somewhat unsettled. He studied art at one point, then turned toward science, eventually enrolling in medical school at Harvard. This shifting path reflects something important about his character. He was not driven by a single clear direction, but by a persistent curiosity. He was searching not for a career, but for a way of understanding the world that felt complete. During his time studying medicine, he became deeply engaged with physiology and the workings of the human body. This gave him a strong grounding in scientific thinking, an appreciation for observation, evidence, and structure. But at the same time, he began to encounter a problem that science alone could not resolve. Understanding how the brain works does not necessarily explain how experience feels. It does not fully capture consciousness, emotion, or the sense of being a self. This tension between objective explanation and subjective experience became central to his thinking. He did not reject science. In fact, he respected it deeply. But he saw that it leaves something out, something essential to understanding human life. His early adulthood was marked by a period of deep personal struggle. He experienced what might now be described as a psychological crisis, a period of intense doubt, anxiety, and paralysis. He questioned his ability to act, to choose, to direct his own life. The idea that everything might be determined by physical processes left him feeling trapped, as if free will were an illusion and his actions did not truly belong to him. This was not just an abstract concern. It affected how he lived. He struggled to make decisions, to move forward, to find a sense of direction. The question of whether human beings have genuine freedom became deeply personal. What makes this moment significant is how he responded to it. Instead of trying to solve the problem purely through theory, he made a decision. He chose to believe in free will, not because he could prove it with certainty, but because the act of choosing itself allowed him to move forward. This decision became one of the most important turning points in his life. From this experience, he began to develop a new way of approaching truth. Instead of asking only whether an idea can be proven in an absolute sense, he asked what difference it makes in practice. Does believing something change how a person lives? Does it open possibilities or close them? Does it lead to action or to paralysis? This shift laid the foundation for what would later be known as pragmatism, a philosophical approach that evaluates ideas based on their practical consequences. Truth, in this view, is not something fixed and independent of human experience. It is something that becomes meaningful through its effects. He began teaching at Harvard, where he moved between physiology, psychology, and philosophy, gradually shaping a new field that would later become modern psychology. His work did not fit neatly into existing categories. He He was not just studying the brain, and he was not just speculating about the mind. He was trying to understand the relationship between them. One of his most important contributions was his exploration of consciousness. Instead of treating it as a static object, he described it as a stream, constantly flowing, changing, and moving. This idea challenged the way people thought about the mind. It suggested that experience is not made up of isolated pieces, but is continuous, shaped by both internal and external factors. This perspective allowed him to bridge the gap between science and lived experience. He did not reduce consciousness to physical processes, but he also did not treat it as something separate from the body. He explored it as something dynamic, something that can be studied, but not fully captured by measurement alone. At the same time, his interest in religion did not disappear. Instead, it evolved. He began to study religious experience not as a set of doctrines, but as something that people actually live and feel. He asked what role belief plays in shaping experience, and how different forms of faith affect individuals in practical terms. By this stage of his life, his thinking had taken a clear direction. He was not searching for a single, absolute system that explains everything. Instead, he was developing a way of thinking that remains flexible, open to experience, and focused on how ideas function in real life. What made his approach powerful is that it did not demand certainty. It allowed for doubt, for change, for growth. It recognized that human understanding is always limited, always evolving, and that this does not make it meaningless, but dynamic. He had begun to redefine what it means to seek truth, not as a fixed destination, but as an ongoing process shaped by experience, choice, and action. As his thinking moved forward, what began to take shape was not just a new set of ideas, but a completely different way of approaching the relationship between mind, reality, and truth itself. He was no longer trying to resolve the tension between science and human experience by choosing one over the other. Instead, he began building a framework where both could exist, not as opposing forces, but as different ways of engaging with the same reality. At the center of this development was his deepening exploration of consciousness. He rejected the idea that the mind could be broken down into fixed parts, as many early scientific approaches attempted to do. Instead, he described consciousness as something continuous, a stream that flows without clear boundaries. Thoughts, sensations, memories, and emotions do not exist in isolation. They merge into one another, forming a constant movement that defines how reality is experienced. This idea was not just descriptive. It changed how the mind itself was understood. If consciousness is a flow rather than a collection of separate pieces, then the self is not something fixed either. It is not a stable object that exists unchanged over time. It is something that evolves, something shaped by experience, attention, and interpretation. This perspective allowed him to move beyond rigid definitions of identity. A person is not simply what they were in the past, nor are they completely defined by their present state. They are a process, something that unfolds over time. This made his approach to psychology more flexible and more aligned with lived experience, where change is constant and rarely follows a simple pattern. At the same time, he began to examine the role of attention in shaping reality. Out of the countless stimuli that surround a person at any given moment, only a small portion enters conscious awareness. What a person chooses to focus on becomes their reality in a practical sense. This means that reality is not just something external that is passively received. It is actively shaped by where attention is directed. This insight had far-reaching implications. It suggested that individuals are not simply observers of the world, but participants in how it is experienced. Two people can exist in the same environment and perceive it differently, not because the world itself has changed, but because their attention and interpretation differ. From here, his philosophy moved more deeply into the nature of truth. Traditional philosophy often treated truth as something fixed, something that exists independently of human experience and must be discovered in its pure form. But he began to question whether this approach fully captures how truth, actually functions in life. He introduced a more dynamic understanding. Truth, in his view, is not something that simply exists waiting to be found. It is something that becomes true through its effects, through the way it interacts with experience. An idea is not meaningful in isolation. Its value depends on what it does, how it shapes thought, action, and understanding. This does not mean that truth becomes arbitrary or purely subjective. He did not argue that anything can be true if someone believes it. Instead, he suggested that truth is tested through experience. Ideas must prove themselves over time, through their ability to work within the world, to provide coherence, to guide action in a way that aligns with reality as it is encountered. This approach allowed him to avoid the extremes of both absolute certainty and complete relativism. Truth is not fixed and unchanging, but it is also not entirely fluid. It exists within a process, something that develops, adapts, and stabilizes through use and verification. His thinking also began to address belief in a more direct way. Why do people believe what they believe? Is belief simply the result of evidence? Or is there something more involved? He observed that in many cases, people must act before they have complete proof. Decisions often have to be made under uncertainty. This led him to argue that belief is not always something that follows evidence. Sometimes belief comes first, enabling action that would otherwise be impossible. This is especially true in areas like religion, morality, and personal commitment, where waiting for absolute proof may prevent any decision from being made at all. He explored this idea in his reflections on what he called the will to believe, the idea that in certain situations, it is reasonable, even necessary, to choose a belief when the evidence is not tied, but the decision itself has real consequences. This was not an argument for blind faith, but for recognizing that human life often requires commitment before certainty. At the same time, his interest in religious experience deepened. Rather than focusing on doctrines or institutional structures, he turned his attention to individual experience. What does it feel like to believe? How does religious experience affect a person's life? What changes does it produce in behavior, perception, and understanding? He approached these questions with the same openness that defined his broader philosophy. He did not attempt to prove or disprove religion in an absolute sense. Instead, he examined its effects, treating it as a real and significant part of human experience that deserves to be understood on its own terms. This approach allowed him to engage with religion without reducing it to superstition or elevating it to unquestionable truth. It became something to be studied, something that can be meaningful without requiring universal agreement. By this stage, his work had begun to influence multiple fields at once. Psychology, philosophy, and even religious studies were all shaped by his ideas. Yet what made his influence unique was that it did not come from a rigid system. It came from a method, a way of thinking that remains open, flexible, and grounded in experience. He did not offer final answers. Instead, he provided a way of approaching questions, one that accepts uncertainty without becoming paralyzed by it, and values experience without abandoning the search for coherence. As his ideas continued to develop, the boundaries between disciplines became less important. What mattered was not whether something belonged to science or philosophy or religion, but whether it contributed to a deeper understanding of how human beings experience and engage with reality. And in that sense, his work was not moving toward a conclusion, but toward a more refined way of thinking itself, one that could continue adapting as new questions emerged. As his thought continued to develop, what became increasingly clear was that he was not trying to build a closed philosophical system, something complete and final that would answer every question. Instead, he was shaping a way of thinking that could remain open, flexible, and responsive to the complexity of real life. This is what gave his work a different kind of strength. It did not depend on certainty. It depended on its ability to remain useful, even as circumstances changed. By this stage, his ideas about truth, belief, and experience began to expand into a broader understanding of how human beings navigate reality as a whole. He recognized that people do not live by abstract principles alone. They live through habits, emotions, relationships, and choices that are often made under conditions of uncertainty. Any philosophy that ignores this complexity, no matter how logically consistent, risks becoming disconnected from actual life. This led him to explore the role of habit in shaping human behavior. While much of his earlier work focused on consciousness and deliberate thought, he now turned his attention to the patterns that operate beneath awareness. Habits, once formed, guide actions without requiring constant decision-making. They create stability, but they can also limit change. He saw habit as both a strength and a constraint. On one hand, it allows individuals to function efficiently, to navigate the world without being overwhelmed by constant choices. On the other hand, it can lock a person into patterns that no longer serve them. This creates a tension between stability and growth, one that must be managed rather than eliminated. From this perspective, personal change becomes more than a matter of deciding differently. It requires reshaping habits, something that takes time, effort, and consistency. This insight made his philosophy more practical. It moved beyond abstract ideas about freedom and into the reality of how change actually occurs. At the same time, his thinking about the self continued to evolve. If consciousness is a stream and identity is not fixed, then the idea of a single, unified self becomes more complicated. He began to describe the self as layered, composed of different aspects that interact with one another. There is the physical self, tied to the body and its needs. There is the social self, shaped by relationships and how one is perceived by others. And there is a more internal sense of identity, connected to thoughts, values, and personal reflection. These layers do not always align perfectly. A person may feel one way internally while presenting something different externally. This understanding allowed him to approach human experience with greater nuance. Instead of reducing behavior to a single cause, he recognized that actions often emerge from the interaction of multiple influences. This made his work more realistic, more aligned with the complexity of actual life. His interest in religion also reached a new level during this period, culminating in his exploration of religious experience as something deeply personal and varied. Rather than asking whether religious beliefs are objectively true in a universal sense, he asked what they do for individuals. How do they shape perception, behavior, and emotional life? He examined cases of conversion, moments where individuals undergo profound changes in belief and identity. These experiences often involve a sense of renewal, a shift in perspective that alters how the world is understood. For him, these transformations were not illusions to be dismissed. They were real psychological events with real consequences. This approach allowed him to treat religion as a legitimate subject of study without requiring agreement on its metaphysical claims. It became part of the broader human experience, something that can be meaningful even if it cannot be fully explained or universally validated. At the same time, he maintained a critical distance. He did not accept all forms of belief equally. He evaluated them based on their effects. Beliefs that lead to greater clarity, stability, and engagement with life were seen as more valuable than those that produce confusion or withdrawal. This brings his philosophy back to its central principle. Ideas are not judged solely by their logical structure, but by how they function in lived experience. This does not eliminate the need for reasoning. It places reasoning within a broader context, one that includes emotion, action, and consequence. As his influence grew, his ideas began to spread beyond academic circles. Thinkers, psychologists, and even ordinary readers found something accessible in his work. It did not require specialized knowledge to understand. It spoke directly to the way people experience their own lives. What made his approach especially powerful was its balance. It did not dismiss science, but it did not reduce everything to it. It did not reject religion, but it did not accept it uncritically. It did not deny uncertainty, but did not allow uncertainty to become an excuse for inaction. By this stage, his philosophy had become a kind of bridge. It connected different ways of understanding the world, showing that they do not have to be in complete conflict. Science, philosophy, and personal experience can all contribute to a broader understanding, even if they do not fully align. Yet within this balance, there remains a quiet challenge. If truth is something that develops through experience, if belief plays a role in shaping reality, and if certainty is never complete, then each individual must take responsibility for how they think and act. There is no final authority that removes this responsibility. This makes his philosophy both empowering and demanding. It gives individuals the freedom to engage with ideas in a flexible way, but it also requires them to remain attentive, to question, to evaluate, and to adjust as they move through life. And in that sense, his work does not lead to a final conclusion. It leads to a way of living, one that remains open, reflective, and deeply connected to the reality of human experience as it unfolds. As his life moved into its final years, the tone of his thinking did not become narrower or more rigid. Instead, it widened, becoming more reflective, more aware of the full complexity of human experience. What he had built over time was not a fixed doctrine, but a living philosophy, one that could adapt, respond, and continue to evolve as new questions emerged. And in these later years, he began to look back at his own work with a kind of quiet clarity, not as something complete, but as something that had opened a path rather than closed one. He had by now established himself as one of the central figures in both psychology and philosophy. Yet his influence did not come from authority in the traditional sense. It came from the way his ideas resonated with real experience. He spoke in a way that did not feel distant or abstract. Instead, his thinking remained close to life, grounded in the everyday struggles, uncertainties, and decisions that define human existence. One of the most important developments in this final stage of his thought was his deepening commitment to what he called a pluralistic view of reality. Rather than seeing the world as a single unified system governed by one ultimate principle, he began to emphasize its diversity, its openness, and its incompleteness. Reality, in his view, is not finished. It is still in the process of becoming. This idea carries profound implications. If reality is not fixed, then the future is not predetermined. It remains open, shaped in part by human action, by the choices individuals make, and by the beliefs they hold. This stands in contrast to deterministic views that treat the world as something already decided, where every event follows inevitably from prior causes. For him, this openness was not just a theoretical position. It was something that could be felt in the way life is experienced. Uncertainty is not simply a limitation of knowledge. It is a feature of reality itself. And within that uncertainty lies possibility. This perspective gave his philosophy a different kind of energy. It was not about discovering a final truth that ends all questioning. It was about participating in an ongoing process where understanding continues to develop and where human involvement matters. At the same time, he continued to explore the nature of belief with even greater depth. He recognized that belief is not just an intellectual position. It is something that shapes perception, directs attention, and influences action. What a person believes affects what they notice, how they interpret events, and what they consider possible. This means that belief is not passive. It plays an active role in shaping reality as it is experienced. This does not imply that reality can be changed arbitrarily by belief alone, but it does suggest that the way reality is encountered is deeply connected to the mindset of the individual. He also became more attentive to the limits of human understanding. Despite all his work, he did not claim to have resolved the deepest questions about existence. Instead, he acknowledged that there are aspects of reality that remain beyond complete explanation. This did not lead him to abandon inquiry, but to approach it with humility. This humility is a defining feature of his later work. He did not present his ideas as final truths, but as contributions to an ongoing conversation. He invited others to engage, to question, and to build upon what he had started. His reflections on religion also reached a more mature stage. Rather than focusing only on individual experiences or specific beliefs, he began to consider the broader role of religion in human life. He saw that for many people, religion provides not just answers, but a framework for meaning, a way of organizing experience and making sense of uncertainty. He did not reduce religion to illusion, nor did he elevate it beyond criticism. Instead, he treated it as one of the many ways human beings respond to the complexity of existence. Its value, like that of any belief system, depends on how it functions in life, whether it supports growth, resilience, and engagement, or whether it restricts and limits understanding. As his health began to decline, there was no dramatic shift in his philosophy. He did not retreat in his certainty or abandon the openness that had defined his thinking. If anything, his awareness of life's limits reinforced his commitment to the idea that understanding is always partial, always evolving. He faced his final years with the same approach that had guided his life, not seeking absolute answers, but remaining engaged with the questions, not trying to control what cannot be controlled, but participating as fully as possible in the experience of living. He died in 1910, leaving behind a body of work that continues to influence how people think about mind, belief, and reality. But his legacy is not contained in any single idea. It lies in the way he changed the approach to thinking itself. He showed that it is possible to take both science and experience seriously, without reducing one to the other. He demonstrated that truth can be understood as something dynamic, something that develops through interaction with the world. And he made clear that uncertainty is not something to be eliminated, but something to be worked with. What remains most powerful about his work is the sense that it does not close off possibilities. It keeps them open. It encourages a way of thinking that is flexible without being vague, grounded without being rigid. In the end, his philosophy leaves behind a quiet but persistent challenge. If reality is still in the process of becoming, if belief shapes experience, and if certainty is never complete, then the responsibility for understanding does not rest outside of us. It rests within how we choose to engage with the world. And that responsibility cannot be avoided. It must be lived continuously through the way one thinks, acts, and responds to the ever-changing flow of experience.